My name is Deanna Calloway. I'm 34 years old, and I was standing in a hospital hallway in my scrubs, the same scrubs I'd been wearing for 9 hours, when my husband looked me in the eye and told me he wasn't going to sign the papers to save our son's life. Not until he had proof. Proof that Cody was actually his. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to. I was standing 12 feet from the room where my 7-year-old was lying in a hospital bed with leads on his chest and an IV in his arm, and the man I had been married to for 6 years was standing in front of me doing math, calculating, deciding whether the child we had raised together, the child he had coached in t-ball and read to at night, and whose school pickup he took credit for at dinner parties, was worth the risk of being wrong about. I don't know how I stayed standing. I think it was the scrubs, honestly. I think my body knew that if I was in my work clothes, I had to be a nurse first. And nurses don't collapse in hallways. But I want to tell you the whole story, because if I just tell you that moment, you won't understand how we got there. And I need you to understand, because this isn't just a story about a bad husband. It's a story about a secret I kept for 7 years, and what it cost me, and what happened when the truth decided it was done waiting for me to be ready. Before I go any further, if you're already feeling something right now, if something about this already landed somewhere familiar, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this. Hit like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely want to know. Okay, let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Cookeville, Tennessee, with my mom, Patty, and my younger brother, Tyler. My dad left when I was 7. No note, no explanation. He just stopped being there one morning the way a chair stops being there when someone moves it to another room. My mom sat on the kitchen floor for 1 hour. She has told me this exactly once, and the telling of it was the most intimate thing she has ever shared with me. After that hour, she got up. She went to work. She did not sit on that floor again. We were not poor in the way that announces itself. We were poor in the way that means you calculate before you go to the emergency room. When Tyler was 11, he broke his arm falling off a fence, and my mom sat in the hospital parking lot for 40 minutes before she went inside. I sat beside her. Neither of us said anything. I was old enough to understand what she was doing, and young enough to feel it in my chest in a way I still haven't entirely put down. What that morning gave me, what I didn't have language for until I was much older, was a promise to myself. No child of mine would ever be weighed against a number. Not ever. Whatever I had to do, whoever I had to become, that would not happen. So I became a nurse. I went to Tennessee Tech on a scholarship and Pell Grants and 2 years of night shifts at a Waffle House. I studied harder than I had ever done anything. I graduated at 23 with my RN license and a specific dream, the pediatric floor at Vanderbilt. Kids who were sick and scared and needed someone to stay in the room with them. I got there by 25. I paid off my student loans by 29 by living like someone who had grown up in a parking lot and understood what was actually necessary and what was just noise. I am telling you this because I need you to know who I was before Marcus. I was not a woman who needed to be completed. I was a woman who had built something real from almost nothing, and I was proud of it in the quiet way you're proud of things you worked for when no one was watching. I met Marcus at 27 at a hospital charity gala, the kind of event I attended because the hospital encouraged it, and I had one dress that worked for those things. He was charming in the focused way that feels like being chosen. He pursued me in a way I mistook for devotion. I had been with someone before him, a man named Garrett Sims, kind and decent but directionless in a way I eventually couldn't grow alongside. I had ended that relationship and moved forward. I was ready, I thought, for something more intentional. Marcus and I got married when I was 28. And if there is a moment where I want to reach back through time and hold my own hand, it's that one. Not to stop it, just to tell her, pay attention to what you're not seeing. The thing about Marcus is that he wasn't cruel in an obvious way. He was managing. Everything was management. He took over the joint account because he said he was better with money, which was probably true in terms of spreadsheets and completely untrue in terms of whose money he was spending carefully. He gave me a monthly allowance for household expenses and called it practical. He stopped coming to hospital events because he said the hours were unreasonable, and then he started making comments about the hours, and then about my colleagues, and then one by one the friends I used to see regularly became people I saw less and less, until they became people I texted occasionally and felt guilty about. I didn't see it as isolation. I saw it as a busy life. That's the thing. When you've grown up in a household where love looks like exhausted forward motion, you don't always recognize when someone is using your capacity for endurance against you. And here is where I have to tell you the thing I have never said out loud before this. 3 months into our marriage, I found out I was pregnant. I was thrilled. Marcus was thrilled, or performed thrilled. I have since stopped being sure which. But when I did the math, the way you do, quietly, privately, in the way your brain does it before you're fully ready, I understood that the timing was off. Not by weeks, by enough. Cody's biological father was Garrett Sims, not Marcus. I was 28 years old. I was 3 months married to a man who was already showing me, in small, careful ways, what happened when he was displeased. I was terrified. I made a decision I have spent 7 years living inside of. I chose to move forward, to believe the timing could be explained, to not have the conversation that needed to happen. I have thought about that decision every single day of Cody's life. Not with the obsessive guilt people imagine when they hear a confession like this, but with a quiet, constant weight. The awareness that I was carrying something that would eventually need to be put down. If you've ever kept a truth for so long that you started to believe the keeping was protecting someone, I think you already know what that feels like. That particular exhaustion. The way the secret becomes structural, like a wall you've painted over so many times you forget the original surface. If that resonates with you, I want you to stay with me through this whole story. Hit like, subscribe, share this with someone who needs it. Because what happens next, I couldn't have predicted it. I don't think anyone could have. Cody was a healthy, stubborn, spectacularly ordinary little boy. He loved dinosaurs with a fervor that I found genuinely impressive. He had Marcus's last name and my hazel eyes, and if Marcus had doubts, and I understand now that he did, that a colleague at a party had made some comment, that Marcus had been running his private calculation, he never brought them to me directly. He let them curdle. He let them become a kind of permission he was building for himself, one quiet resentment at a time. That is the thing about people who manage everything. They don't confront, they accumulate, and then they wait for the moment when the confrontation will cost you the most. On a Tuesday in October, I was 40 minutes into my shift when my phone vibrated with Cody's school ringtone, the one I have never once sent to voicemail. And the school nurse's voice told me that my son had collapsed during lunch. I was already moving before she finished the sentence. By the time I reached the emergency department, and there is something specifically terrible about running through a hospital where you work, where people know your face and can see what's happening on yours, Cody was already in a bay. He had leads on his chest and an IV in his left arm, and he looked so small on that bed that I had to stop in the doorway for 1 full second just to make myself breathe before I went in. The ER attending, a woman named Dr. Solis, who I had worked alongside for 3 years, met me at the curtain. She had the careful eyes of someone who has delivered difficult news enough times to know exactly how to hold their face. She told me what they had found. A congenital cardiac defect, structural, present since birth, silent for 7 years. The kind of thing that can exist without a single symptom until the body reaches a threshold it wasn't built to cross. Cody had crossed it during lunch on a Tuesday, in the middle of a sentence about something, and his heart had stuttered in a way that dropped him to the cafeteria floor. He needed surgery. Not scheduled. Not in a week after a second opinion and some breathing room. The conversation was about how soon, not whether. I went to his bedside and I took his hand, his small, warm, very much alive hand, and I kept my voice in the register I use at work, the one that says everything is going to be okay, without lying about the specifics. I said, "You're okay, baby. Mama's right here." He believed me. He always believes me. That has always been one of the great honors and great responsibilities of my life. I called Marcus. Voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sent a text that said, "It's Cody. Hospital. Come now. It's serious." 22 minutes passed. I know it was 22 because I watched the clock on the bay wall the way you watch something when you need to keep your mind inside a number instead of inside a feeling. His response came back with a period at the end, not a question mark. "On my way. What happened?" He arrived 40 minutes later. He was in his office clothes with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, the deliberate kind of rolled, not the rushed kind, and his hair was neat, and the wedding ring he had stopped wearing 8 months ago and told me was at the jeweler was, of course, not there. My brain filed all of this without my permission. That is what crisis does. It catalogs everything. Dr. Raymond Okafor met us both in the hallway. He is Cody's surgeon, a man I have worked near for 4 years and respected in the specific way you respect someone who never needs to announce what they are. He is 52 years old, with silver at his temples and the physical stillness of someone who has been the calmest person in the room for so long it has become structural. He explained the situation with precision and without softening the edges. Surgical correction was necessary. The risk of waiting exceeded the risk of operating. He needed both parents to sign the authorization form. Marcus listened. He asked 2 questions that sounded responsible: recovery time, surgical team credentials, and I watched him ask them and understood that he was performing due diligence for an audience of 1, which was himself. And then he said, quietly, with the particular tone he used when he had already decided something and was only now announcing it, "I need a moment with my wife." We stood in an alcove off the main hallway, fluorescent light, the sound of the floor doing its constant work in the background. And Marcus said the thing I have turned over in my mind every single day since. "I'm not signing anything until I know that boy is actually mine." Have you ever had a moment where your body understands something before your mind catches up? Where your hands go very still and your vision gets slightly too sharp and you can feel your heartbeat in a completely specific location, like behind your back teeth? That is where I was. Standing 12 feet from my son, being asked to prove his existence was worth the paperwork. I said, "Our son is in that room." He said he had been suspicious for 2 years. He said a colleague, he named the party, he named the man, had made a comment about Cody not looking like him. He said he should have demanded a paternity test when Cody was born. He used the word financial twice in 4 sentences. He told me he wasn't being cruel. He told me he was being a man who needed to know the truth before taking on responsibility. I want to tell you something about that moment, and I need you to hear it clearly. Marcus was not wrong that there was a truth. He was catastrophically wrong about what that truth meant, and even more wrong about when and how a person deploys a suspicion they've been privately nursing for 2 years. There is a version of this conversation that could have happened at a kitchen table. There is a version that could have happened in a therapist's office. He chose a hospital hallway. He chose it because that is where I had the least ground to stand on and the most to lose. That was not accidental. I have asked myself so many times since then whether he was cruel or just deeply, completely prioritizing his own need for control over every other thing in that moment? And I have come to believe the answer is that for some people, those two things are the same. I went back to Dr. Okafor. I told him, in controlled and specific language, that my husband was refusing to sign. I kept my voice professional. I kept my face the way I keep it on the floor when I am telling a parent something that will break their afternoon. Dr. Okafor was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I counted. Then he said, "Follow me. I want you to think about what it means to have someone use the people you love as leverage. To have someone look at your child, your actual child, the person you would walk through fire for without checking the temperature, and turn that child into a bargaining chip in an argument they've been having with you in their head for 2 years without telling you. I wonder if you've ever been in a room like that, where the person across from you knows exactly which door to knock on because they know you'll always answer. Drop that in the comments if you have. Tell me what that felt like for you. I read every single one." Dr. Okafor pulled up Cody's chart on the workstation at the nurse's station, a station I have stood at hundreds of times, a station where I know where the pens are kept and which monitor runs slow. He pulled up the pre-surgical blood work panel he had ordered when Cody was admitted, standard for every pediatric surgical case. And he showed me Cody's blood type, a positive. Then he opened a second window, the emergency contact intake form Marcus had filled out 4 years ago during a procedure at this same hospital. He did this quietly and without editorializing. He simply put the 2 pieces of information next to each other on the screen and let me look. Marcus's blood type, O negative. I have been a nurse for 11 years. I know blood type genetics the way I know how to tie a double knot on a shoe. 2 O negative parents cannot produce an A positive child. It is not a matter of probability, it is a matter of biology. The room did not spin. I want to be honest about that because people always expect the room to spin. What actually happened was that everything went very, very still. Like the moment after a loud noise, when the air is still holding the shape of the sound, Dr. Okafor said, carefully, in the voice of a man who has delivered complicated truths to frightened people for 26 years. This doesn't change what needs to happen in the next 2 hours, but it does change the conversation about authorization. He asked me if I knew who Cody's biological father was. And here is the moment I have rehearsed in my head 1,000 different ways. The moment where I could have said I wasn't sure, where I could have asked for time, where I could have managed the information the way I had been managing it for 7 years. I looked at Dr. Okafor, a man I had watched hold the hands of frightened parents in hallways exactly like this one, and I said, yes. I gave him Garrett's name. I told him Garrett didn't know. Dr. Okafor did not flinch. He did not judge me. He looked at me with the specific steadiness of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by what human beings are capable of, both the hard things and the brave ones. And he said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." My mother arrived 20 minutes later. She had driven from Cookville when I called. I don't even remember calling her, but apparently I did, sometime in the hallway while I was still holding myself together with both hands. She found me sitting against the wall outside the bay with my knees up and my face in my hands. It was the only moment in this entire story where I fully broke. She sat down on the floor beside me. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on my back. That was all. That was everything. Dr. Okafor made 2 calls. The first was to the hospital's legal team. I sat in a chair beside the nurse's station and listened to him speak in the measured, unhurried tone of a man who has learned that calm is a form of power. That if you never raise your voice, people have to lean in and listen. The legal team confirmed what he already knew. In cases where a legal parent refuses medical authorization for a child who is not biologically theirs, Tennessee law has an expedited pathway for emergency surgical consent given acute medical necessity. It was not instant. It would take time. But it was a door, and it was open, and Dr. Okafor was already walking through it before the call ended. The second call was to Garrett Sims. I don't know exactly what Dr. Okafor said to him. I wasn't in the room. What I know is that Garrett arrived 53 minutes later, and that 53 minutes is a long time to sit in a hospital hallway, knowing that the person walking toward you is about to have his entire understanding of the last 8 years rearranged in a conversation you are going to have to lead. I heard him before I saw him, his footsteps, which I had apparently not forgotten, the slightly uneven rhythm of someone who walks fast but lands heavy on the left. He came around the corner and he stopped when he saw me. He looked stunned in the way of someone who is not trying to hide being stunned, which was already different from Marcus. He stood there for a moment, and I stood up, and we looked at each other across about 10 feet of hospital corridor, and neither of us said anything for a breath that lasted longer than a breath. He looked older, steadier. The directionless quality I remembered from our 20s had resolved into something quieter. Not ambition exactly, just settledness. He was wearing a work jacket over a flannel shirt, and his hands were the hands of someone who works with them, which I registered in the way nurses register hands. I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you respond." He said, "Okay." I told him, all of it. The timing I had calculated and then chosen not to look at directly. The fear I had been 28 years old and newly married and already quietly afraid of. The decision I made to move forward and what moving forward had cost me every day since. I told him about Cody, not a summary, but Cody specifically. The dinosaurs, the way he mispronounced exactly one word in every sentence when he was tired, the gap between his front teeth, the way he smelled after bath time. I wanted Garrett to know who he was before he knew what I was asking. Garrett sat with all of it. He didn't make it about himself. He didn't ask the questions I had been afraid of, the accusatory ones, the ones that would have been understandable but would have broken something I needed to remain intact for the next hour. He sat with it the way a person sits with something heavy, when they understand that now is not the time to put it down and examine it, that there will be time for that later, that right now there is only one thing that matters. He said, "What do we need to do right now?" I handed him the authorization form. He read it, actually read it, all of it, in the careful way of someone who respects what they're signing, and then he signed his name on the line. Cody went into surgery 19 minutes later. I have thought a lot about those 19 minutes, about what it means that it was a near stranger's signature, a man who had driven to a hospital for a child he had not known existed an hour before, that got my son into that operating room. I have sat with the specific injustice of it, and also with the specific grace of it, because both things are true, and neither one cancels the other out. My mother and I sat in the surgical waiting area. Garrett sat across from us, a few seats down, in the particular posture of a person who is trying to be present without imposing. Marcus was also in the waiting room. He had not left. I have thought about why he stayed, and I have arrived at the same answer every time. He was still calculating, still waiting to see how the situation resolved before deciding what his position on it would be. That is the thing about people who manage everything. They don't leave until they know which version of events they're going to need. We did not speak. I did not look at him. My mother looked at him once, for about 3 seconds, in the way she looks at things she has already fully assessed and found wanting. And then she looked away and offered me half of the granola bar she had found in her jacket pocket. And that was the end of her engagement with Marcus Hale. The surgery took 3 hours and 12 minutes. Dr. Okafor came through the doors, and I was on my feet before I consciously decided to stand. He looked at me first, not at Marcus, not at the room, at me. And he said, "Cody is out of surgery. The repair was successful. He has a normal, full life ahead of him. I cried in the way I had been not crying for several hours, which meant it was silent and total and came from somewhere so deep it didn't have a sound attached to it. My mother put both arms around me from behind and held on. Across the room, Marcus stood and arranged his face into the appropriate expression and began to move toward Dr. Okafor. And Dr. Okafor looked at him, just looked, for one quiet moment, and then walked past him, walked directly to me. It was such a small thing. It was not small at all. I was allowed back to see Cody 20 minutes later. He was groggy and pale and had a tube in his arm, and his hair was matted from the surgical cap, and he was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life. He opened his eyes when he heard my voice, and he said, in the specific muzzy register of a child coming out of anesthesia, "Mama, my chest hurts." I said, "I know, baby. It's going to feel better. You did so good." He said, "Did you stay?" I said, "I never left." He closed his eyes again, and his hand found mine under the blanket and held on, and I sat in that chair beside his bed, and I did not move for 2 hours. This is the moment, this one right here. If you have ever loved someone so completely that the thought of them being frightened and you not being there is physically unbearable, if you have ever sat beside someone's bed and understood that the whole machinery of your life, everything you built and sacrificed and endured, existed to be able to be in that chair at that moment, then you already know what I felt in that room. You don't need me to describe it. Hit that like button if this is hitting you somewhere real. Subscribe so you're here for what comes next. Because what happened after, what Marcus did, and what I finally did, that's where this story finds its spine. Garrett came to the doorway of Cody's room once, briefly. He didn't come in. He stood at the threshold and looked at Cody sleeping, and I watched his face do something complicated and private, and I gave him that moment without interrupting it. He looked at me and nodded once, the nod of a person who has just agreed to something enormous without using words, and then he left. We would have the rest of the conversation later. There was going to be a lot of later to navigate. Marcus came to the doorway too. Sometime in the second hour, when Cody was more deeply asleep and I had finally let myself eat half a bag of crackers from the vending machine my mother had thrust into my hands. He stood there in his rolled sleeves and his absent ring, and he looked at Cody, and then he looked at me, and he said, "We need to talk." I said, "Not tonight." He said, "Deanna." I said, "Not tonight, Marcus." He left. My mother stayed. She pulled the other chair in the room close to mine, and she sat beside me in the way she has always sat beside me. Not in front, not behind, just exactly alongside. And we watched Cody sleep together in the particular silence of two people who have been through enough to know that sometimes surviving a day is sufficient. Sometimes that is the whole accomplishment. At some point close to midnight, she said, quietly, without looking away from Cody, "I never liked him." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "I should have said it." I said, "I wasn't ready to hear it." She made the small sound she makes when she accepts something she can't change and is deciding to move forward from it. And then she reached over and took my hand the way she must have taken it when I was small, before I can remember, in whatever moments she wasn't too exhausted to reach for me. We stayed like that until morning. I went home the next afternoon, once Cody was stable and moved to recovery, and had eaten half a cup of green Jell-O with the focused intensity of someone undertaking important work. My mother drove me. I sat in the passenger seat of her car, a 12-year-old Civic that smelled like potting soil and the specific peppermint candies she keeps in the cup holder, and I watched Cookville's highway give way to Nashville's, and I did not say a single word the entire drive. She did not require me to. Marcus was not at the house when I got there. His car was gone. I did not know where he was, and I found, standing in my own front hallway, still in the same scrubs I had put on 2 mornings ago, that I did not particularly need to know. I showered. I remade the bed even though it didn't need remaking. I pulled every sheet off and put clean ones on with the particular focus I bring to things when my hands need to be doing something my brain can direct. I reorganized the spice cabinet. I wiped down the kitchen counters twice. I was not okay, but I was functional, and functional was what the next several days required. Cody came home 4 days later. He was instructed to rest, which he interpreted loosely, and to avoid strenuous activity, which he found deeply inconvenient given his general philosophy about being 7. He was given a list of restrictions and a follow-up schedule, and a small compression garment he wore over his chest that he initially resisted and then decided made him look, in his words, like a superhero who got hurt in a battle. I let him keep that story. It seemed accurate enough. Marcus came back the night Cody came home. He came in quietly, while Cody was already asleep, and he stood in the kitchen doorway while I was making tea, and he said, "I'm sorry about how I handled things at the hospital." I turned around and looked at him. I looked at him for a long time. Not with anger. I had moved through anger already, or at least through the first layer of it. But with the specific clarity that comes when you have been awake for 40 hours and then slept for 12 and woken up into a life that has been permanently rearranged. I said, "Which part?" He said, "All of it." I panicked. I wasn't thinking straight. I said, "You were thinking very straight, Marcus. That's what I've been sitting with." He didn't have an answer for that. People who manage their presentation rarely do when the presentation fails, because the backup system is also presentation, and when that fails too, there is nothing underneath. I had seen it before in small moments throughout our marriage, the particular blankness that arrived when he ran out of ways to frame something in his favor. I had always looked away from that blankness before. I did not look away from it now. I said, "I'm not doing this tonight. Cody is home and he's sleeping, and tonight is about that." Marcus nodded. He went to the guest room. He did not argue, which told me he was still calculating, still deciding which approach would be most effective, still treating our marriage like a negotiation he intended to win. He was in the guest room for 11 days. On the 12th day, I called a lawyer. Her name was Sandra Obi, a family law attorney in Nashville with a reputation for being exact and unhurried, which were the two qualities I most needed. I sat across from her in her office on a Tuesday morning while Cody was at school and my mother was at our house in case he came home early, and I told her everything. The marriage, the finances Marcus controlled, the savings account he didn't know about, the situation at the hospital, Garrett, the biology, all of it, in the sequential, specific way I give a patient history, because that is how my brain works when I am serious, and I was very serious. Sandra listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You've been more organized about this than most people who've been planning it for years." I told her I hadn't been planning it. She said, "Your nervous system had been." I think she was right. I also called Garrett that week, not because I was in love with him, I was not, and I want to be clear about that because this story is not a love story in that direction, but because what he had done in that hospital deserved a real conversation, and because Cody deserved a father who knew he existed. We met for coffee at a place in East Nashville that was quiet on weekday mornings, and we sat across from each other with our hands around our cups, and we had the conversation we had not had time for in the hospital hallway. Garrett had a lot of feelings. He was entitled to every one of them. He did not aim them at me like weapons, which I had been braced for. He asked questions, and he listened to the answers, and at the end he said, "I'm not going anywhere. Whatever this looks like, however we figure it out, I'm not going anywhere." I believed him. Not because I needed to, but because I had watched him sign that form. The divorce proceedings began 6 weeks after the hospital. Marcus, to no one's surprise, immediately became litigious. He retained a lawyer and began contesting assets and framing the narrative in the way he had always framed narratives, which was to say, in the way most favorable to Marcus. He told people, in the careful social circle they had built, that was really his social circle, that I had deceived him for the entirety of our marriage, that I had trapped him, that he was the wronged party. Some people believed him. People tend to believe the version of a story they hear first, especially when it's delivered by someone in a good suit who maintains eye contact. My mother called me one evening while I was making Cody's dinner and told me what was being said. I listened. I stirred the pasta. I said, "Okay." She said, "That's all you've got?" I said, "The people who matter already know what happened." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mm-hmm," which is her highest form of agreement. Here is what Marcus did not know, what his lawyer did not know, what the carefully managed narrative did not account for. Dr. Okafor had documented everything. Not in a conspiratorial way, not in a way that was designed to be a weapon, but in the precise and thorough way of a physician who understands that medical records are a form of truth-telling that exists outside of anyone's ability to reframe. The blood type results, the timeline of the authorization refusal, the notation that emergency legal pathways had been pursued due to an unwilling legal guardian. All of it was in the record. All of it was date and time-stamped. All of it was real in the way that only documented things are real when everything else is contested. Sandra subpoenaed the records. Marcus's lawyer went very quiet in a very specific way when they arrived. The financial discovery process was its own education. What Sandra found, what the forensic accountant she brought in found in the joint accounts Marcus had managed with such careful authority, was a loss of approximately $90,000 in a private real estate investment Marcus had made without disclosing it to me, which in Tennessee constitutes marital waste. The man who had given me a household allowance and called it practical had been hemorrhaging our shared assets into a venture he had hidden entirely. The man who had questioned whether Cody was worth the cost of surgery had been quietly losing the equivalent of a surgery every few months for the better part of 2 years. I sat in Sandra's office when she showed me the numbers, and I thought about the word financial. The way he had said it twice, the way it had sounded like principle when it was actually panic. Cody recovered fully. By week 3, he was trying to negotiate his way back to the playground, and by week 5, Dr. Okafor cleared him for normal activity and he ran. Actually ran, arms out, in the pure physical joy of a child whose body has been given back to him, across our backyard in the late afternoon light, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched him and felt something I can only describe as the specific relief of a promise kept. The one I made to myself in a hospital parking lot when I was 11 years old, sitting beside my mother, understanding for the first time what it meant to weigh a child against a number. I had not let it happen. Whatever else was true, I had not let it happen. The week the divorce was finalized, I did one last thing. I sat at the kitchen table after Cody was asleep, with a cup of tea that went cold while I was writing, and I wrote Marcus a letter. Not to send, just to write. I do not know what I thought it would accomplish, and I think I knew even then that it wasn't for him. It was for me, the way certain things need to be spoken even when there is no one to hear them. I wrote, "You chose the worst possible moment to ask for the truth, but I chose 7 years of silence. We both made choices we're going to have to live inside of. I hope you find a way to live in yours without needing someone else to be the reason for them." I folded it and put it in the kitchen drawer where I keep things I haven't decided what to do with yet. Takeout menus. A birthday card from a colleague. Cody's first lost tooth in a small plastic case the school gave us. The letter sat among these things, which felt appropriate, not precious, just present. My name is Deanna Calloway. I am 34 years old, and I am standing at my kitchen sink on a Thursday evening, washing the dinner dishes, while Cody argues very persuasively from the living room that he has definitely already brushed his teeth, which he has definitely not. The window above the sink faces the backyard. The light at this hour comes in low and amber, and it catches the steam from the water, and for a moment the whole ordinary scene has a quality I don't have a word for. Not beautiful exactly, just exactly right. Like something that finally fits the space it's in. My wedding ring has been in a small dish on the windowsill for 3 months. I keep meaning to decide what to do with it. I keep finding other things to do instead. Maybe that is its own kind of decision. Before I go, I have one question I want to leave with you. Has someone ever done something for you in a moment of crisis? Something quiet, something that cost them something, that you only fully understood later? Garrett signed that form without knowing the whole story yet. Dr. Okafor walked past my husband to get to me. My mother sat on a hospital floor. I keep thinking about the people who show up without being asked and without making it about themselves. Drop that in the comments. Tell me about someone who showed up for you when it mattered. I want to know. And if this story meant something to you, if it sat with you somewhere real, like this video, subscribe so you're here for the next one, and share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth, even a hard one, even one you've been carrying for 7 years, is always worth more than the silence you built around it to keep everyone comfortable, including yourself. I'll see you in the next one.